The snow came down so thick that Rourke couldn't see his horse's ears, and he'd been riding through Wyoming territory blizzards long enough to know that meant trouble. February 1882 had brought one of the worst winters anyone in Taylor could remember, and Ryan had spent the better part of the day trying to round up stray cattle that had wandered from the ranch he worked on. Now, with the light fading and the wind howling like a pack of wolves, all he wanted was to get back to the bunkhouse and warm himself by the stove. His hands were numb inside his leather gloves. His face felt like someone had been scraping it with ice, and Copper, his bay gelding, was struggling through drifts that came up to his chest. Ryan was about to turn south toward the ranch when he heard something that made him pull up short. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it sounded like a woman's voice. He sat perfectly still in the saddle, straining to hear over the storm. There it was again, definitely a voice calling for help. "Hello," Ryan shouted, his words torn away by the wind. "Where are you?" The response was weak, but closer than he'd expected. Ryan urged Copper forward, scanning the white landscape for any sign of movement. The snow was coming down so hard that visibility was maybe 10 feet at best. He called out again, and this time he heard the voice more clearly, off to his right. That's when he saw her. At first he thought it was just a drift of snow against some brush, but then he realized it was a woman in a dark coat, half buried in a snowbank. She was moving, trying to dig herself out, but her movements were slow and uncoordinated. Ryan's heart kicked into a gallop. He'd seen enough people die from cold to know she didn't have much time. He swung down from Copper and stumbled through the snow toward her. When he reached her side, he could see she was young, maybe in her early 20s, with dark hair plastered to her pale face. Her lips had a blue tinge that he didn't like at all. "I've got you," he said, grabbing her under the arms. She was deadweight, barely conscious, and getting her out of the snowbank took all his strength. "Stay with me now. What's your name?" "C.C. Catherine," she managed through chattering teeth. "Catherine Zimmerman." "All right, Catherine, I'm Ryan. I need to get you on my horse. Can you help me at all?" She tried to move her legs but couldn't seem to make them work. Ryan didn't waste any more time talking. He bent down and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, which worried him. He couldn't tell how long she'd been out here, but it had clearly been too long. Getting her onto Copper was a challenge. The horse was steady, used to rough handling, but adding a second person in these conditions was asking a lot. Ryan finally managed to get himself in the saddle with Catherine sitting in front of him, leaning back against his chest. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady and gathered the reins with his other hand. "Where were you headed?" he asked, but she didn't answer. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel her shivering violently. That was actually a good sign. It meant her body was still trying to warm itself. When the shivering stopped, that's when you really had to worry. The ranch was at least an hour's ride away in good conditions. In this storm, it might as well have been in Montana. There was no way she'd make it that far. Ryan's mind raced through his options. There was an old line shack about 20 minutes northwest of here, if he could find it in this mess. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof that the ranch used during spring roundup, but it would get them out of the wind. He turned Copper's head and gave him his lead. Horses had better instincts than people in weather like this. Copper knew where shelter was, and Ryan trusted him to find it. The ride felt like it took forever. Catherine had stopped shivering, which scared Ryan more than he wanted to admit. He kept talking to her, saying anything that came to mind, trying to keep her conscious. He told her about the ranch, about Copper, about the time he'd seen a bear steal a pie from the cook's windowsill. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he kept talking anyway. Just when he was starting to think they'd missed the shack entirely, it materialized out of the snow like a ghost. Ryan had never been so happy to see such a sorry excuse for a building in his life. He pulled Copper right up to the door and half fell out of the saddle, still holding Catherine. She was completely limp now, her breathing shallow. The door wasn't locked. Nobody locked anything out here. Ryan kicked it open and carried Catherine inside. It was dark and not much warmer than outside, but at least the wind couldn't reach them. He laid her down on the dirt floor as gently as he could and went back out for Copper. The horse needed shelter too, and there was a lean-to attached to the shack that would keep him out of the worst of the storm. Ryan worked quickly, unsaddling Copper and making sure the horse had access to the lee side of the lean-to where snow hadn't drifted as badly. Then he grabbed his saddlebags and the bedroll tied behind the saddle and hurried back inside. Catherine hadn't moved. Ryan knelt beside her and pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, thready and weak, but there. He had to get her warm and fast. There was an old potbelly stove in the corner, rusty but functional. Ryan had helped stock this place last fall, so he knew there should be firewood and supplies. He felt his way through the darkness to the back wall and found a wooden crate with kindling, matches, and a few pieces of split wood. Thank God! His hands were shaking so badly from cold that it took 3 tries to strike a match, but finally, he got a small flame going. He fed it carefully with kindling, then larger pieces of wood, until a real fire was burning in the stove. The light filled the small shack, and for the first time, Ryan could really see Catherine's face. Even pale and half-frozen, she was beautiful. She had fine features, high cheekbones and dark lashes that lay against her cheeks like fans. But what struck him most was how vulnerable she looked, lying there in her wet clothes with snowmelt pooling around her. Wet clothes. That was the problem. Ryan had been in enough bad situations to know that wet clothes would kill her faster than anything. He needed to get them off her and get her into something dry. The only dry things in this shack were in his saddlebags, an extra shirt and his bedroll. He hesitated. It didn't feel right, undressing an unconscious woman he'd just met. But leaving her in wet clothes didn't feel right either, and between the two options, only one of them would keep her alive. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, even though she couldn't hear him. "I'm just trying to help." He worked as quickly and respectfully as he could, removing her wet coat, her dress, her boots. Everything was soaked through. He averted his eyes as much as possible and covered her with his spare shirt, which hung on her like a tent. Then he wrapped her in both blankets from his bedroll and moved her closer to the stove. Her undergarments were hung over a nail to dry, along with her dress and coat. Ryan tried not to think too hard about what he was doing. His mother had raised him to be a gentleman, and this felt like crossing a line, even if it was necessary. Once Catherine was as warm and dry as he could make her, Ryan turned his attention to his own soaked clothing. His coat and gloves were dripping, his boots were full of snow, and his shirt was damp with sweat and snowmelt. He hung everything up to dry and changed into the one dry pair of socks he had in his saddlebags. There was nothing to do about his pants except wring them out and put them back on. At least with the fire going, the shack was starting to warm up. Ryan checked on Catherine again. Her breathing seemed a little stronger, and some color was returning to her cheeks. He sat down next to her and took her hand, rubbing it between his own to encourage circulation. Her fingers were long and slender, with calluses that suggested she wasn't a stranger to work. "Come on, Catherine," he murmured. "Wake up. Tell me how you ended up out here in the middle of a blizzard." Hours passed. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Ryan kept the fire going, checking on Catherine regularly. Around what he guessed was midnight, he dozed off sitting up, his back against the wall. He woke to find Catherine staring at him. Her eyes were blue, he noticed. Very blue, like a summer sky. They were wide and confused, darting around the unfamiliar shack before settling back on him. "You're awake," Ryan said, relief flooding through him. "How do you feel?" "Cold," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse and confused. "Where am I?" "Line shack about 10 miles north of Taylor. I found you in a snowbank. Do you remember what happened?" Catherine's brow furrowed as she tried to recall. "I was traveling with my uncle. We were coming from Cheyenne, headed to his homestead north of here. The storm came up so fast. Our wagon lost a wheel and the horses spooked. They ran off with the wagon and my uncle went after them. He told me to stay put, but the cold." She shook her head. "I don't remember much after that. I tried to find shelter, started walking, but everything looked the same, white everywhere." "Your uncle's name?" "Thomas Zimmerman." Ryan nodded. "Once the storm breaks, we'll look for him. Right now, you need to rest and get your strength back. Are you hungry?" "I don't know." "Maybe." Catherine tried to sit up, then seemed to realize she was wearing only a shirt and blankets. Her cheeks flushed. "My clothes. Had to get you out of them. They were soaked. Everything's drying by the stove." Ryan kept his voice matter-of-fact professional. "I didn't look more than I had to. You were freezing to death." "Thank you," Catherine said quietly, "for saving my life. Not many men would have gone to such trouble. Couldn't just leave you out there." Ryan stood and went to his saddlebags. He had some jerky and hardtack that would have to do for food. "It's not much, but you should eat something." Catherine accepted the jerky and chewed it slowly. Ryan could see her taking in details of the shack, of their situation. She didn't seem scared, which he appreciated, just cautious and thoughtful. "How long have I been unconscious?" she asked. "About 5 hours, give or take. Lost track of time." Ryan fed another piece of wood into the stove. "You gave me quite a scare. Your lips were blue when I found you." "I thought I was going to die," Catherine admitted. "I couldn't feel my hands or feet anymore. The snow just kept coming down and I couldn't see anything. I tried to call for help, but I didn't think anyone would hear me." She looked at him with those blue eyes, and Ryan felt something shift in his chest. "You saved my life. Just did what anyone would do. That's not true, and you know it." Catherine pulled the blanket more tightly around herself. "In my experience, most people only help when there's something in it for them. You risked your life in that storm for a stranger." Ryan didn't know what to say to that. He'd grown up believing you helped people because it was the right thing to do, but he'd met enough folks who didn't share that belief to know Catherine had a point. "Where are you from originally?" he asked, changing the subject. "You don't sound like you're from Wyoming." "Boston," Catherine said. "I came west 6 months ago after my parents died. My Uncle Thomas is my only living relative. He wrote to me, offered me a home on his homestead. I didn't have much reason to stay in Boston, so I came. That's quite a change. Boston to Wyoming. You have no idea." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Everything here is so different, so vast and empty. In Boston, you're never alone. Buildings everywhere, people everywhere. Here you can ride for hours and not see another soul." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Catherine considered this. "Both, I think. It's lonely sometimes, but it's also freeing. In Boston, everyone knew who I was, who my family was. There were expectations, rules about how a young woman should behave. Here, I can just be Catherine." Ryan understood that feeling more than she knew. He'd come to Wyoming 5 years ago to escape his own past, his own expectations. Out here, nobody cared that he was the youngest son of a Virginia family that had lost everything in the war. Nobody asked questions about why a man who'd been raised to manage a plantation was working as a cowhand. "I know what you mean," he said. They fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the stove. Catherine's eyes were starting to droop again, and Ryan could see exhaustion pulling at her. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch, keep the fire going." "You need rest too," Catherine protested, but even as she said it, her eyes were closing. "I'll rest later. Sleep now." This time when Catherine drifted off, it was natural sleep, not the unconsciousness of hypothermia. Ryan watched the rise and fall of her breathing and felt that strange shift in his chest again. He told himself it was just relief that she was going to be all right, nothing more. But as the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Ryan found himself studying Catherine's sleeping face in the firelight. There was something about her that drew him in. Maybe it was her strength, the way she'd handled waking up in a strange place with a strange man without falling apart. Maybe it was the sadness he'd heard in her voice when she talked about losing her parents. Or maybe it was something simpler than that, something he didn't have words for. Dawn came slowly, the darkness outside shifting from black to gray. The wind had died down some, but snow was still falling steadily. Ryan moved to the door and peered out. The world was white as far as he could see, with drifts piled high against the shack. They weren't going anywhere today. Behind him, Catherine stirred. "Morning," she said, her voice clearer than it had been the night before. "Morning. How do you feel?" "Better. Sore, but better." She sat up carefully, keeping the blanket wrapped around herself. "Is it still storming?" "Some. Not as bad as yesterday, but we're snowed in for now." Ryan closed the door against the cold. "Probably be another day before we can move." "Another day?" Catherine looked worried. "My uncle will be frantic. If he's got any sense, he found shelter and stayed put. Going out in that storm would have been suicide." Ryan moved back to the stove. "There's not much food, but I can make it stretch for a couple days if we're careful. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden. This situation isn't your fault." Ryan meant it. He'd been in plenty of tight spots in his years out west, and he'd learned that blame didn't help anything. You dealt with what was in front of you and did your best to survive. "Still, I'm sorry you're stuck here because of me." "I'm stuck here because of the storm, same as you." "Rather be stuck with company than alone." That earned him a small smile. Catherine pushed her hair back from her face, and Ryan noticed how the firelight caught in it, bringing out warm brown undertones. She had a few freckles scattered across her nose that he hadn't noticed before. "Is there water?" she asked. "Snow. I can melt some for drinking." Ryan found a dented pot in the supplies and went outside to fill it with clean snow. When he came back in, Catherine had moved closer to the stove, still wrapped in her blanket cocoon. They spent the day talking. There wasn't much else to do. Catherine told him about Boston, about her life before coming west. Her father had been a clerk, and they'd lived in a modest house in a respectable neighborhood. She'd been educated at a dame school and had expected to marry a local boy and live a quiet, conventional life. Then scarlet fever had swept through the city, taking both her parents within a week of each other. "I was 22, she said. "Old enough that people expected me to manage on my own, but young enough that respectable work was hard to find. I could have found a position as a governess, maybe, or a companion to an elderly lady. But Uncle Thomas's letter came, and it seemed like a sign, a chance to start over." Ryan shared his own story in return, though he left out some of the harder parts. He told her about growing up in Virginia, about losing his family's land after the war, about drifting west because there was nothing left for him back east. He'd worked as a cowhand for various outfits, finally landing at the Triple R Ranch outside Taylor about 2 years ago. "You like it? Cowhand work?" Catherine asked. "It's honest work. Hard but honest. I like working with animals, being outside, and I like the people I work with." Good men for the most part. You ever think about doing something else? Ryan considered this. Sometimes. I've saved up some money, thought about maybe getting my own place someday, running a few head of cattle, but that's a long way off. You should do it, Catherine said with surprising conviction. Life's too short to put off dreams. I learned that when my parents died. You think you have all the time in the world and then suddenly you don't. Her words struck something in Ryan. He'd been telling himself for years that he'd make his move when the time was right, when he had enough saved, when the circumstances were perfect. But Catherine was right. There was no guarantee of tomorrow, especially out here. What about you? He asked. What are your dreams? Catherine was quiet for a moment. I want to build something, she finally said. I don't know exactly what yet, but I want to look at something and know I made it, that it exists because of me. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. The conversation drifted to lighter topics. They discovered they'd both read some of the same books, though Catherine's literary education was far more extensive than Ryan's. She'd read Dickens and Austen and the Brontes, while Ryan's reading had been mostly newspapers and dime novels. Catherine promised to lend him some of her books when they got to her uncle's place, if they'd survived the wagon accident. By evening, Catherine's clothes were dry enough to wear. Ryan turned his back while she dressed, staring determinedly at the wall until she told him it was safe to turn around. She looked more like herself in her own clothes, though the dark blue dress was wrinkled from its ordeal. I must look a sight, she said, trying to smooth the wrinkles. You look fine, Ryan said, and meant it. She looked more than fine, actually, but he kept that thought to himself. They shared another meager meal of jerky and hardtack, washed down with melted snow water. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, though the wind was still blowing drifts around. Tell me about Taylor, Catherine said as they sat by the fire. What's it like? Small. Maybe 300 people if you count the outlying ranches. There's a main street with a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a livery stable. The railroad came through about 5 years ago, which helped the town grow. We get supply trains regular now, which makes life easier. Do you go into town often? Once or twice a month when the ranch can spare me. Usually just to pick up supplies or mail. Sometimes the boys and I go to the saloon on a Saturday night, play some cards, have a drink. Is there a church? Yes, though we don't have a regular preacher. Circuit Rider comes through about once a month, holds services in the schoolhouse. Catherine nodded, taking all this in. Ryan could see her trying to picture the life she was heading toward, so different from what she'd known in Boston. Are people friendly? She asked. Mostly. Wyoming folks are generally live and let live. We help each other when times are hard, which is most of the time, but we don't pry into each other's business. Ryan poked at the fire. Your uncle's place is north of town, you said. About 15 miles, according to his letters. He's been homesteading there for 3 years, has a cabin, some livestock, grows wheat and vegetables. I might know the place. There aren't too many homesteads that far north, hard country up there. Uncle Thomas said it was challenging, but he seemed to like it. He's not a man who needs much. Ryan hoped Thomas Zimmerman had survived the storm. The man must be half crazy with worry about his niece by now, if he was still alive. Tomorrow, if the weather held, they'd have to start looking for him. The second night in the shack passed much like the first, except this time both of them slept, taking turns keeping the fire going. Ryan woke once in the deep hours of the night to find Catherine sitting by the stove, staring into the flames. The light played across her face, and she looked so alone that Ryan felt an unexpected urge to comfort her. Can't sleep? He asked quietly. Catherine startled slightly, then shook her head. Just thinking. About my uncle, mostly, hoping he's all right. He probably found shelter just like we did, Probably. But she didn't sound convinced. Ryan sat up and moved to sit beside her. Tomorrow we'll look for him. The storm's past. We'll find him. What if we don't? What if he's? She didn't finish the sentence. Then we'll deal with that when we come to it. No sense borrowing trouble. Catherine turned to look at him, and in the firelight her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I can't lose him too. He's all the family I have left. Without thinking, Ryan reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, meant to comfort, but the moment his skin touched hers, something electric passed between them. Catherine felt it too. He could see it in the way her eyes widened slightly, in the catch of her breath. You won't lose him, Ryan said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I promise we'll do everything we can to find him. Catherine's fingers tightened around his. Thank you, Ryan, for everything. I know I keep saying it, but I don't know how else to express what you've done for me. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do. She was still holding his hand, and neither of them seemed inclined to let go. You're a good man. I haven't met many good men. Ryan didn't know what to say to that. He was acutely aware of how close she was, of the warmth of her hand in his, of the way the firelight made her skin glow. He knew he should let go, move back, maintain proper distance, but he didn't want to. You should try to sleep, he finally said, though he didn't release her hand. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Will you stay here, just for a little while? Yeah, I'll stay. They sat together by the fire, hands linked, until Catherine's head began to nod. Ryan helped her settle back into the blankets, then returned to his spot against the wall. But he couldn't stop thinking about the feel of her hand in his, about the look in her eyes, about the strange ache that had settled in his chest. He told himself it was just the circumstances. Isolated together, dependent on each other for survival, that created bonds that might not mean anything in the real world. Once they got back to civilization, once Catherine was reunited with her uncle, this feeling would fade. But even as he thought it, Ryan knew he was lying to himself. Morning came clear and cold. When Ryan stepped outside, the world was transformed. Snow covered everything, smoothing rough edges and turning the landscape into something almost beautiful. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only got after a storm, sharp and bright enough to hurt your eyes. Copper was fine, having weathered the storm in the lean-to. Ryan checked him over carefully, making sure the horse hadn't injured himself or developed any problems from the cold. Everything looked good. Catherine emerged from the shack, blinking in the bright sunlight. It's beautiful, she said, surprise in her voice. Beautiful and deadly, Ryan said. We need to be careful. The snow's deep, and there could be drifts that'll swallow a horse. Where should we start looking for my uncle? You said your wagon lost a wheel. Do you remember where that happened? Catherine looked around, trying to get her bearings. Everything looked different under feet of snow. I think it was south of here. We were on the main road to Taylor, planning to cut north once we reached town. The wheel broke about mid-afternoon, maybe an hour before I started walking. Ryan did some mental calculations. If Catherine had been walking for an hour in a blizzard, she probably hadn't covered more than a mile or two. The road to Taylor was east of the shack, which meant the wagon had broken down somewhere southeast of their current position. We'll head southeast, try to find the road, he said. If we can locate the wagon, that'll give us a starting point. They packed up what little they had. Ryan made sure the fire was completely out, then helped Catherine onto Copper. She sat in front again, and Ryan tried not to notice how right it felt to have her there, how well she fit against him. The ride through the deep snow was slow going. Copper struggled with the drifts, and several times Ryan had to dismount and lead him through particularly bad spots. Catherine held onto the saddle horn, her eyes scanning the white landscape for any sign of the wagon or her uncle. An hour into the ride, they found the road. It was barely visible under the snow, but Ryan could tell by the way the land lay. They turned south, following what he thought was the track. "There," Catherine pointed ahead, excitement in her voice. "Is that the wagon?" It was, or what was left of it. The wagon was on its side in a ditch, half buried in snow. One wheel was completely gone, and the supplies that had been in the back were scattered. There was no sign of the horses or Thomas Zimmerman. Ryan dismounted and helped Catherine down. She immediately started calling for her uncle, her voice echoing across the empty snowscape. There was no answer. "He went after the horses," Catherine said, looking around frantically. "He went south, I think. Or maybe east. I can't remember." "Easy," Ryan said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "We'll find him. Let me look around, see if I can find tracks." The snow had covered most evidence of what had happened, but Ryan was a good tracker. He circled the wagon slowly, reading what signs he could. There were hoofprints heading east, already filling in with blown snow but still visible. And there, barely noticeable boot prints following them. "This way," Ryan said, pointing east. He went after the horses, heading east. They followed the trail slowly. It was hard going, and several times Ryan lost the tracks entirely and had to cast about to find them again. Catherine was silent, tense with worry. Ryan kept reassuring her that they'd find him, that Thomas had probably just holed up somewhere to wait out the storm, but he was starting to worry himself. The tracks were more than a day old. A lot could happen in that time. They'd been following the trail for about 30 minutes when they saw the horses. Both of them were standing in a small hollow, huddled together for warmth. They looked rough but alive, and lying next to them, partially covered in snow, was a man, Uncle Thomas. Catherine scrambled down from Copper before Ryan could stop her, running through the snow toward the motionless figure. Ryan was right behind her. Thomas Zimmerman was unconscious, but alive. Ryan could see his chest rising and falling. The man had clearly tried to catch the horses, maybe succeeded, but then the cold had gotten to him. He'd collapsed here, and by some miracle, the horses had stayed with him, their bodies providing just enough warmth to keep him from freezing to death. "Is he alive?" Catherine's voice was desperate. "Yes, but he's in bad shape. We need to get him warm." Ryan looked around. They were too far from the shack now, but Taylor was maybe an hour's ride south. "We need to get him to town, to the doctor." Between the two of them, they managed to get Thomas onto one of the wagon horses. Ryan tied him in place so he wouldn't fall, then helped Catherine onto Copper. He took the reins of the second wagon horse and started south toward Taylor, moving as fast as he dared. The ride felt endless. Catherine kept looking back at her uncle, fear written all over her face. Ryan pushed as hard as he could without foundering the horses. Thomas needed a doctor, needed warmth and care, needed it now. Taylor materialized out of the white landscape like an oasis. Ryan had never been so happy to see the small collection of buildings that made up the town. He headed straight for Doc Morrison's place, a small house on the east end of Main Street. "Doc," Ryan shouted, pulling up in front of the house. "Doc Morrison, we need help." The door opened, and a gray-haired man in his 60s peered out. When he saw the unconscious man tied to the horse, he moved quickly. "Get him inside," Doc Morrison said. "What happened?" "Caught in the storm," Ryan said as he and the doctor worked to get Thomas down. "Been out in the cold for more than a day." They carried Thomas inside and laid him on the examination table in the doctor's front room. Doc Morrison went to work immediately, checking vital signs and barking orders. Catherine hovered nearby, wringing her hands. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked. "Too soon to tell," the doctor said, not looking up from his patient. "He's suffering from severe exposure, frostbite on his fingers and toes, but his heart's still beating and he's breathing, so that's something." "Young lady, I need you to step back and let me work." Ryan gently took Catherine's arm and guided her to a chair in the corner. She sank into it, her face pale with worry. Ryan knelt beside her. "He's in good hands," he said. "Doc Morrison is the best there is." "I can't lose him," Catherine whispered. "I just found him again. He's all I have." "You won't lose him. Your uncle's tough. He lasted this long, he'll make it." They waited while Doc Morrison worked. The doctor cut away Thomas's frozen boots and outer clothing, wrapped him in warm blankets, and tried to get some warm liquid down his throat. After what felt like hours, he finally turned to them. "He'll live," the doctor said, but it was close. Another few hours and it would have been a different story. "He'll lose some toes to frostbite, maybe a finger or two, but he'll live." Catherine sagged with relief. Ryan put his hand on her shoulder and she reached up to cover it with her own. "Thank you, doctor," she said. "Thank you so much. Don't thank me. Thank whoever found him and brought him in." Doc Morrison looked at Ryan. "That you, me, and Miss Zimmerman here. Well, mostly her. She's his niece." "Where are you staying, miss?" the doctor asked. Catherine looked uncertain. "I don't know. I suppose the hotel. You'll stay here," Doc Morrison said firmly. "I have a spare room upstairs. Your uncle will need care over the next few days and you'll want to be close. You too, young man. You look about done in." Ryan was about to protest that he should get back to the ranch, but then he realized he was exhausted. He'd been up for nearly 2 days straight and his body was reminding him of that fact forcefully. "That's kind of you, Doc," he said. "Not kind, practical. Besides, I can use the help. I'm not as young as I used to be. Miss Zimmerman, you can take the room at the top of the stairs. Mr. Rourke, Ryan Rourke. Mr. Rourke can take the small room in back. There's a bed and it's warm, that's all that matters." Over the next 3 days, Ryan and Catherine settled into a routine at Doc Morrison's house. Catherine sat with her uncle during the day, talking to him even though he was unconscious, reading to him from a book of poetry the doctor had on his shelf. Ryan helped Doc Morrison with various tasks around the house and tended to the horses, making sure they were properly cared for at the livery stable. In the evenings, after the doctor had retired to his own room, Ryan and Catherine would sit together in the main room, talking quietly so as not to disturb Thomas. They talked about everything and nothing. Catherine told him more about her life in Boston, about the friends she'd left behind and the life she'd thought she'd lead. Ryan opened up about things he rarely discussed with anyone: his family, the war, his dreams for the future. "You think you'll ever go back to Virginia?" Catherine asked one evening. Ryan shook his head. "Nothing there for me anymore. The plantation's gone, sold for taxes. My mother died when I was 15. My father died at Gettysburg. My older brother went west before I did, and I haven't heard from him in years. Virginia's just a place on a map now, it's not home." "Where is home then?" "Here, I suppose, Wyoming. It's not much, but it's mine. I chose it. That counts for something." "I understand that. I never chose my life in Boston. It just happened to me. But coming here, that was my choice. Whatever happens, at least I can say I chose it." On the 3rd day, Thomas Zimmerman woke up. Catherine was sitting beside his bed, reading aloud, when his eyes fluttered open. She gasped and grabbed his hand. "Uncle Thomas, can you hear me?" "Catherine." His voice was weak and raspy but clear. "What happened? Where am I?" "Taylor, at the doctor's house. You went after the horses and collapsed. Ryan Rourke found us and brought us here." Thomas's eyes found Ryan, who was standing in the doorway. "You saved my life." "Saved both of you," Doc Morrison said, brushing past Ryan to check on his patient. "Now stop talking and let me examine you." The examination confirmed that Thomas would lose 3 toes and part of 1 finger to frostbite, but otherwise, he was in remarkably good shape for a man who'd nearly frozen to death. Doc Morrison said he could move to the hotel in a few days. once he was stronger. That evening, Thomas asked to speak with Ryan privately. Catherine left the room reluctantly, and Ryan pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Doc tells me you risked your life in that storm to save my niece," Thomas said. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Just did what needed doing," Ryan said. "Don't downplay it. You could have ridden on, looked for shelter for yourself. Instead, you saved Catherine, then tracked me down. I owe you a debt I can never repay. You don't owe me anything." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "You're a good man, Ryan Rourke. I can see it in you, and I can see the way you look at my niece." Ryan felt his face heat. "Sir, I assure you I've been completely respectful. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just observing." Thomas shifted in the bed, wincing. "Catherine's been through a lot. Lost her parents, came out to this harsh country to live with an uncle she barely knows. She needs stability, someone she can depend on." "She has you," Ryan said. "I'm an old man, and I'm not as strong as I used to be. This winter proved that. I won't always be around to look after her." Thomas fixed Ryan with a penetrating look. "But I think you would. Look after her, I mean." Ryan didn't know what to say. The truth was, he'd been thinking about Catherine constantly. About her strength, her intelligence, her quiet courage. About the way she looked in the firelight and the feel of her hand in his. About how empty his life was going to feel when she left. "I care about her," Ryan admitted, "but I'm just a cowhand. I don't have much to offer." "You have more than you think. Character counts for more than money out here." Thomas closed his eyes, clearly tiring. "I'm just saying, if you're interested, you have my blessing. Whatever comes of it is between you and Catherine, but you have my blessing." Ryan left the room in a daze. He found Catherine in the kitchen, helping Doc Morrison prepare supper. "How is he?" she asked. "Tired, but better. He's going to be fine." Catherine smiled, and Ryan felt his heart do a strange flip in his chest. He had to tell her how he felt. Thomas had given him permission, or at least not forbidden it. But what if she didn't feel the same way? What if the connection he'd felt was one-sided? At night, after supper and after Thomas and Doc Morrison had both gone to bed, Ryan found Catherine sitting on the front porch despite the cold. She'd wrapped herself in a thick blanket and was staring up at the stars. "You'll freeze out here," Ryan said, stepping outside. "I needed air. I've been cooped up in that house for 3 days." She gestured to the space beside her on the porch step. "Sit with me." Ryan sat, very aware of how close she was. For a few minutes they just looked at the stars in silence. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were so bright they looked like they'd been scattered across black velvet. "Ryan," Catherine said softly, "what happens now?" "What do you mean?" "I mean after my uncle is well enough to travel. We'll go to his homestead and you'll go back to your ranch, and we'll probably never see each other again." Ryan's heart was pounding. "Is that what you want?" "No." Catherine turned to look at him, and in the starlight her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "No, it's not what I want at all. These past few days, getting to know you, I've felt, I don't know how to describe it, like I've found something I didn't know I was looking for." "I feel it too," Ryan said. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Catherine, I know we haven't known each other long. I know the circumstances were unusual, but I've never felt this way about anyone before." "What way?" "Like I've been cold my whole life, and you're the first warmth I've ever known." Catherine drew in a sharp breath. "Ryan, I don't have much to offer you," he continued in a rush. "I'm just a cowhand with some savings and a lot of dreams. But if you'd be willing to wait, to give me a chance to make something of myself, I'd work every day to be the man you deserve." "You already are the man I deserve," Catherine said, and there were tears running down her cheeks now. "You're brave and kind and honest. You saved my life, not just from the cold but from loneliness. These past few days with you have been the happiest I've been since my parents died." Ryan reached out and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. Then stay. Not at your uncle's place, but with me. Marry me, Catherine. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy. But we barely know each other. We know enough. I know you're strong and smart and brave. I know you make me laugh and you make me want to be better. I know that when I think about the future, you're in it. That's enough for me. Catherine was quiet for a long moment and Ryan's heart sank. He'd moved too fast, said too much. Then she smiled and it was like the sun coming up. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you, Ryan Rourke. Ryan felt like all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Yes, yes, Catherine laughed, a sound full of joy and relief. I know it's crazy and impulsive, and I've never done anything crazy or impulsive in my life, but yes, 1,000 times yes. Ryan pulled her into his arms and she came willingly, burying her face in his shoulder. They held each other there on the cold porch, two people who'd found each other by accident and by fate. When? Catherine asked, her voice muffled against his coat. As soon as possible. Tomorrow if the circuit rider is in town. Next month if he's not. I don't want to wait. Ryan pulled back so he could see her face. Is that all right? It's perfect. They went inside and told Doc Morrison first, since he was still up, reading in his chair by the fire. The old doctor just smiled and said he'd suspected as much. In the morning, they told Thomas, who received the news with quiet satisfaction. I knew you were a smart young man, he said to Ryan, but I didn't know you were smart enough to propose within a week of meeting her. Uncle Thomas, Catherine scolded, but she was smiling. I'm just glad I'll have family nearby, Thomas said. The homestead is lonely. It'll be nice to have neighbors. About that, Ryan said. He'd been thinking about this all night. Sir, I have some savings. Not a lot, but enough to buy some cattle, maybe rent some grazing land. What if, instead of working for the RRR, I partnered with you? We could combine resources, build up both our places. I can handle the heavy work while you're recovering and you can teach me about farming. It could work. Thomas considered this. It could work, he agreed slowly. But I won't take charity. It's not charity, it's business and family. Ryan glanced at Catherine. We'll need a place to live while we build our own cabin. Your place is bigger than mine. We could stay with you, help you with the work, and you could help us get established. Everyone benefits. Then we have a deal. Thomas extended his hand and Ryan shook it firmly. The circuit preacher wasn't due in Taylor for another 3 weeks, so they had to wait. Ryan didn't mind. It gave him time to settle things with the RRR ranch, to collect his savings from the bank, and to help Thomas prepare for the trip back to his homestead. Catherine spent the time getting ready for her new life. The ladies of Taylor, always eager for something interesting to happen, rallied around her. They helped her piece together a trousseau from donated fabrics, shared recipes and advice about homesteading, and made her feel welcome in the community. Ryan found himself accepted into a circle of married men who gave him knowing looks and clapped him on the back with congratulations. He bought a gold ring from the general store, simple but solid, and hid it in his pocket where he'd take it out sometimes just to look at it. 3 weeks had never felt so long. Finally, the day came. The circuit preacher, a Methodist minister named Reverend Hartwell, arrived on a Friday afternoon. The wedding was set for Saturday morning in the schoolhouse, and it seemed like half the town turned out. Catherine wore a simple dress of blue calico that matched her eyes. One of the town ladies had lent her a white shawl for the occasion. She carried a small bouquet of dried flowers, all that was available this early in spring. To Ryan, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Ryan spoke his vows in a clear, strong voice, promising to love and cherish Catherine for all his days. When it was Catherine's turn, Her voice shook with emotion, but she didn't falter. "I do," she said when the preacher asked if she would take Ryan as her husband. "I do, with all my heart." Ryan slipped the gold ring onto her finger, and when Reverend Hartwell pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle and full of promise. The town put on a small celebration after the ceremony. There was food and music, and someone produced a fiddle. Ryan wasn't much of a dancer, but he led Catherine through a simple waltz, both of them laughing at his missteps. "You're terrible at this," Catherine teased. "I know. But you're stuck with me now. I wouldn't have it any other way." As the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of pink and gold, Ryan and Catherine said their goodbyes and headed to the small room at the hotel that would serve as their wedding night accommodation. Tomorrow they'd start the journey to Thomas's homestead, to begin their life together. But tonight was just for them. Ryan closed the door behind them and turned to find Catherine watching him with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. He crossed the room slowly and took her hands in his. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said softly. "I know. But I'm ready, Ryan. I want this. I want you." Their second kiss was less gentle than the first, full of all the longing and desire they'd been holding back. Ryan had never wanted anything as much as he wanted Catherine in that moment, but he forced himself to be patient, to be tender. This was new for both of them, and he wanted it to be right. Later, lying in the darkness with Catherine's head on his chest and her hand over his heart, Ryan thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. If the storm had come an hour later, if he'd turned south instead of hearing her voice, if any one of 100 small things had been different, they never would have met. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked sleepily. "About how lucky I am. About how you changed everything." "You changed everything for me too. Before I met you, I was just surviving. Now I'm living." "We'll have a good life," Ryan promised. "I'll work hard, build us a home. We'll have children someday if you want them, grow old together." "That sounds perfect." They fell asleep tangled together, warm and content and certain of their future. The next several months were a blur of hard work and new experiences. Thomas's homestead was indeed isolated, a small cabin on 160 acres of rough land. The cabin needed repairs after the winter, and there was plowing and planting to be done. Ryan threw himself into the work with an energy born of purpose. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was building a future for his family. He and Thomas worked side by side, and Ryan learned farming from a man who'd been doing it alone for 3 years. Catherine worked just as hard, planting a garden, preserving food, making the cabin into a home. In the evenings, they'd all sit together and make plans. Ryan and Thomas would expand the fields next year, get more cattle. Ryan would build a cabin of his own on the adjoining land, which Thomas helped him file a claim for. They'd help each other with the big jobs, the way neighbors did out here. Summer came, hot and dry. The crops struggled, and there were days when Ryan wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. But Catherine never doubted. She worked alongside him in the fields, her hands calloused and her face tanned by the sun, and at night she'd curl up beside him and remind him why they were doing this. "We're building something," she'd say. "It won't be easy, but it'll be ours." Autumn brought the harvest, smaller than they'd hoped but enough to see them through the winter. Ryan and Thomas sold some of their wheat in Taylor and bought supplies for the cold months ahead. Catherine worked tirelessly, preserving vegetables and meat, making sure they'd have enough food. As winter approached, Ryan began building their cabin. He chose a spot on his new land with a good view of the mountains, near a creek that ran year-round. The cabin would be small at first, just one room, but they'd add on as they needed. Every evening after the day's work was done, Ryan would go to the site and work by lantern light, placing stones for the foundation, cutting and notching logs. Thomas helped when he could, though his injury from the storm still bothered him. Catherine came by every day, bringing food and water, helping where she could. She had opinions about where the windows should go, how big the fireplace should be. Ryan listened to all of it and incorporated her ideas. This was her home too. The cabin was finished just before the first snow. It was a simple structure but solid. Ryan had made sure of that. He'd built it to last, to shelter his family for years to come. The day they moved in, Catherine cried. Happy tears, she assured him, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him until he forgot all about the boxes that still needed unpacking. It's perfect, she said, looking around at the rough log walls and the stone fireplace Ryan had built with his own hands. It's absolutely perfect. That winter was easier than the last, though no less cold. But Ryan and Catherine were prepared. They had food, fuel, and most importantly, they had each other. On the coldest nights, they'd lie together in their bed, listening to the wind howl outside, and Ryan would think about how different his life was now. A year ago, he'd been alone, working another man's ranch, living in a bunkhouse with a dozen other cowhands. He'd had no real future, no purpose beyond the next paycheck. Now he had land, a home, a wife he loved more than he'd thought possible. He had purpose and meaning and hope. "Are you happy?" Catherine asked him one night in January. "Happier than I've ever been." "Why?" "I just wanted to make sure. I know this life is hard. I know you work yourself near to death every day. I wanted to make sure it's worth it." Ryan pulled her closer. "Catherine, everything is worth it as long as I'm doing it with you. You're not just my wife. You're my partner, my best friend. You're the reason I wake up in the morning." "That's quite a lot of pressure to put on one person," Catherine teased, but her voice was thick with emotion. "You can handle it. You're the strongest person I know." Spring came again, and with it news. Catherine was pregnant. She told Ryan one morning over breakfast, her hands shaking as she poured his coffee. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "We're going to have a baby." Ryan's mind went blank for a moment, and then joy flooded through him so intensely he thought he might burst. He jumped up from the table, picked Catherine up, and spun her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We're having a baby," he repeated, as if saying it would make it more real. "Catherine, we're going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly shy. "Happy. I'm over the moon. I'm walking on clouds. I'm the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed well. Catherine continued working, though Ryan and Thomas both tried to get her to take it easier. She refused, insisting she felt fine, that work was good for her. Doc Morrison came out to check on her once a month and pronounced her in excellent health. As Catherine's belly grew, Ryan found himself building again. A cradle this time, from cherry wood he traded for in town. He worked on it in the evenings, carving patterns into the headboard, making sure every edge was smooth. This cradle would hold his child, keep them safe. It had to be perfect. The baby came in late October, after a long night of labor that terrified Ryan more than any blizzard or stampede ever had. Doc Morrison was there, calm and competent, and Thomas waited outside with Ryan, both of them pacing and praying. When the baby's cry finally split the night, Ryan nearly collapsed with relief. Doc Morrison came out exhausted but smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Rourke. You have a son." A son. Ryan had a son. He went into the bedroom on shaking legs. Catherine was propped up against the pillows, pale and exhausted but glowing with happiness. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a quilt her mother had made years ago. "Meet your son," Catherine said softly, turning the baby so Ryan could see his face. Ryan looked down at the tiny features, the dark eyes squinting up at him, the small fist waving in the air. His son. His and Catherine's son. He's perfect, Ryan whispered. Catherine, he's absolutely perfect. We need to name him, Catherine said. I was thinking about my father's name, William, but I wanted your input. William is good. William James, after both our fathers, William James Rourke. Catherine smiled. It's perfect. Ryan reached out and carefully took his son in his arms. William was so small, so fragile. Ryan was terrified he'd break him just by holding him, but William seemed content, settling into his father's arms with a small sigh. I'm going to be a good father to you, Ryan promised quietly. I'm going to teach you everything I know. I'm going to make sure you grow up knowing you're loved and wanted. You're going to have the life I never had, I swear it. He already has the most important thing, Catherine said, reaching up to touch Ryan's face. He has parents who love him and love each other. Everything else is just details. The years that followed were full and rich. William grew from an infant to a curious toddler who followed Ryan everywhere, learning to walk in the fields while his father worked. 2 years after William was born, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Catherine's mother. 3 years after that came another son, Robert, who arrived so fast that Doc Morrison almost didn't make it in time. Ryan and Catherine's small cabin grew with their family. Ryan added rooms, built a better barn, expanded their fields. With Thomas's help and a few hired hands during busy seasons, they built up a respectable operation. They weren't rich by any means, but they were comfortable. They had enough. Thomas lived to see all 3 of his great nieces and nephews born. He died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1889, a month before his 70th birthday. They buried him on a hill overlooking both properties, marked with a simple stone that read, Thomas Zimmerman, beloved uncle, faithful friend. Ryan and Catherine inherited his land, which they combined with their own. The Rourke homestead, as it came to be known, eventually encompassed more than 300 acres. Not huge by Wyoming standards, but enough to support the family and provide for the next generation. The children grew. William, serious and studious, wanted to go to school to learn about law and business. Ryan encouraged this, using some of their savings to send him to school in Cheyenne when he was 16. Margaret, spirited and determined, was her mother's daughter through and through. She had no interest in leaving the homestead and learned everything she could about farming and ranching. Robert, the youngest, was fascinated by horses and showed an early talent for training them. Through it all, Ryan and Catherine's love never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger with time. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. They still held hands when they walked. They still kissed goodnight every evening and good morning every day. Did you ever think our lives would turn out like this? Catherine asked one evening. They were sitting on that same porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. William had married and moved back to Taylor to practice law, but he visited often with his wife and 2 children. Margaret had married a neighboring rancher and lived just 5 miles away with her husband and 4 children. Robert, still unmarried at 23, lived with Ryan and Catherine and ran the horse breeding operation that had become a significant part of the family business. No, Ryan admitted. When you asked if I thought we'd moved too fast, married too soon, I said we knew enough. But I had no idea. I had no idea how much I'd come to love you, how deep it would go. I had no idea how good life could be. I'm glad I got caught in that blizzard, Catherine said. That's a terrible thing to say. You almost died. But I didn't. You found me. You saved me. And because of that storm, we found each other. Catherine leaned against Ryan's shoulder, still fitting there as perfectly as she had 30 years ago. Sometimes I think about how many things had to go exactly right for us to meet. If the storm had come an hour later, if you'd gone a different direction, if you hadn't heard me calling. So many ifs. I try not to think about the ifs, Ryan said. I just focus on what is. And what is pretty damn good. Language, Catherine scolded without heat. The children are grown, I can say damn if I want to. Old man, you're the same age as me. Yes, but I hide it better. Ryan laughed and pulled her closer. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children play, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant colors. You ever regret it? Ryan asked. Leaving Boston, coming out here, marrying a cowhand you barely knew? Not for a single second. This life, this family, it's everything I never knew I wanted. Every hardship, every challenge, it's all been worth it. Catherine turned to look at him, and her blue eyes were as bright as they'd been when she was 24. You were right, that night on Doc Morrison's porch. You were cold your whole life, and I was too. We were both just surviving, just getting through. But together, we learned how to really live. We became each other's warmth. Ryan kissed her then, gentle and sweet, the kiss of two people who knew each other completely and loved each other anyway. When they pulled apart, the sun had set and the stars were coming out. Come on, old woman, Ryan said, standing and offering his hand. Let's go inside. Robert's wife is making dinner and you know how she gets if we're late. Robert doesn't have a wife, Catherine pointed out. Yet. Mark my words, that Carson girl has her eye on him. There'll be a wedding before the year is out. You're probably right. Catherine took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Even after all these years, the touch of his hand still sent a little thrill through her. You're usually right about these things. That's because I'm wise and experienced. Old, you mean? Same thing. They walked into their home together, hand in hand, while their grandchildren played outside and the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass. Behind them, the porch where they'd shared so many evenings stood empty, waiting for the next sunset, the next conversation, the next moment of peace in lives that had been full and hard and beautiful. Inside, the house was warm and bright with lamplight. The dinner table was set for a crowd: Robert and his almost certain future wife, Margaret and her family who'd come for a visit, William and his brood who'd decided to stay the night. The house rang with laughter and conversation, with children running and adults calling for them to slow down. This was the legacy of that blizzard 30 years ago. Not just Ryan and Catherine, but everyone who came after. The children, the grandchildren, the life they'd built together from nothing but determination and love. That night, after everyone had eaten and the house had finally quieted down, Ryan and Catherine lay in their bed, the same bed Ryan had built when the cabin was first finished. Through the window, they could see the stars, countless and bright. I love you, Catherine said softly. I don't say it enough, but I do, more than anything. I know I love you too. Ryan pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. Thank you, Catherine, for what? For saying yes. For taking a chance on me, for building this life with me. For being the warmth I never knew I needed. Catherine smiled in the darkness. Thank you for finding me, for saving me, for loving me even when I was a half-frozen mess in a snowbank. Especially then, Ryan said. They drifted off to sleep together, as they had every night for 30 years. Outside, the wind picked up, reminding them that winter was coming again. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms, they were warm. They would always be warm as long as they had each other. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow as years do. They lost friends to age and illness. They celebrated more weddings, welcomed more grandchildren. Robert did indeed marry the Carson girl, a spirited young woman named Alice who fit into the family as if she'd always been there. They had 3 children in quick succession, filling the old homestead with noise and laughter. Ryan and Catherine grew older, their hair turning white, their movements slower. But their love never aged. They still held hands. They still talked for hours. They still kissed goodnight on their 40th wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a party. Half the county came, it seemed. People brought food and told stories about Ryan and Catherine, about their kindness and generosity, about how they'd helped neighbors in need, about the family they'd built. William stood up to make a speech, his lawyer's eloquence serving him well. My parents taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every day. It's showing up, doing the work, being there for each other through good times and bad. They've shown me what a real partnership looks like, what it means to build a life with someone. I'm grateful every day for their example. Margaret spoke next, her voice thick with emotion. Mama once told me that she and Papa found each other by accident but loved each other on purpose. I think about that a lot. How lucky we all are that they found each other, that they chose each other, that they built this family and this legacy. Everything I am, everything I have exists because of their love. Robert, never comfortable with public speaking, kept it simple. They're the best parents anyone could ask for. And the best example of what marriage should be. I'm proud to be their son. Ryan and Catherine sat together, hands clasped, tears running down their cheeks as their children and grandchildren spoke. When it was finally their turn to respond, Ryan stood and helped Catherine to her feet. I'm not good with words like William, Ryan said, but I want you all to know that every day with Catherine has been a gift. 40 years ago, I was just a cowhand with no real future. Then a blizzard came, and I found a half-frozen woman in a snowbank, and my whole life changed. She became my wife, my partner, my best friend. She gave me children and grandchildren. She gave me purpose and meaning. She gave me warmth when I'd been cold for so long. I am the man I am today because of her. Catherine spoke next, her voice clear despite her years. Ryan saved my life that day in the snow. But he did more than that. He gave me a reason to live. He gave me love and family and a home. Every moment of these 40 years has been precious, even the hard times because we faced them together. I love you, Ryan Rourke, today, tomorrow, and always. The party continued late into the night, but eventually Ryan and Catherine slipped away to their cabin. They walked slowly, arm in arm, comfortable with the pace that age required. That was lovely, Catherine said. The children did such a good job. They did. Although I could have done without William's story about the time I fell in the pig pen. That was a good story, very funny. I'm glad you thought so. They reached the cabin and went inside. It was quiet now with just the two of them. The grandchildren had all gone to their own homes, and Robert's family lived in the newer house that had been built on the property a few years back. Ryan built up the fire while Catherine changed into her nightgown. When he joined her in bed, she immediately curled up against him, finding her familiar spot in the curve of his shoulder. 40 years, she mused. That's a long time. Best 40 years of my life, mine too. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Ryan, I want you to promise me something. Anything? When I'm gone, Catherine, no, listen. When I'm gone, I want you to keep living. Really living, not just going through the motions. The children will need you. The grandchildren will need you. Promise me. Only if you promise me the same thing. I promise. Though I think we both know I'm too stubborn to die anytime soon. Ryan laughed. That's true. You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met. And you love me for it. I do. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, warm and content. Outside, the Wyoming wind blew cold, but inside they had all the warmth they needed. Ryan Rourke died in the spring of 1912, at the age of 72. It was a beautiful morning, the kind he'd always loved. He woke early as usual, kissed Catherine good morning as he'd done every day for 50 years, and went out to check on the horses. He had a heart attack in the barn, quick and painless. By the time Robert found him, he was gone. Catherine grieved deeply, but she kept her promise. She kept living. She spent time with her children and grandchildren. She worked in her garden. She sat on the porch every evening and talked to Ryan as if he were still there, telling him about her day, about the family, about how much she missed him. 2 years later, Catherine Zimmerman Rourke followed her husband. She died in her sleep, peacefully, with a smile on her face. Her children liked to think she was dreaming about Ryan, about that first night in the lined shack when they'd talked until dawn, about all the years they'd had together. They buried her next to Ryan on the hill overlooking the property, near Uncle Thomas. The whole county came to the funeral. Catherine and Ryan had touched so many lives, helped so many people. Their legacy lived on not just in their children but in the community they'd helped build. William inherited the house and the main property. Margaret and Robert each received parcels of land. But more than that, they inherited their parents' example of love, commitment, and partnership. They passed those lessons on to their own children, who passed them on to theirs. Years later, one of Catherine and Ryan's great-great-grandchildren, a young woman named Emma, stood on that same hill, looking down at the two simple headstones side by side. She'd grown up hearing stories about her ancestors, about the cowboy who'd found a woman in a blizzard, and the love story that had started there. Emma was 18, on the brink of her own future, full of questions about life and love and what really mattered. She stood there in the Wyoming wind, reading the inscriptions on the stones. Ryan Rourke, 1840–1912. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, he found warmth in the cold. Catherine Zimmerman Rourke, 1841–1914. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she was the warmth he found. Emma smiled, touching the worn stones gently. She understood now. Love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It was about showing up, doing the work, choosing each other every single day. It was about being someone's warmth when the world was cold. She walked back down the hill toward the old homestead, toward her own life and her own future. But she carried Ryan and Catherine with her, their story and their love, a legacy that would never fade as long as someone remembered to tell it. And far away, in whatever place souls go when bodies die, Ryan and Catherine Rourke were together still, walking hand in hand through eternal summer, warm at last and forever.